Hello, team. It's me, Jonathan MS Pierce. I've been fed and watered by my owners. I'm not being taken to the stud farm, so I thought, what better thing to do than make a frontline video update for the 27th of May 2023 for the Ukraine war. Let's get to our usual starting point, which is in the northeast sector, the axis from Kupiansk to Svatva to Kreminna. Shame that it doesn't put the names on here on the new style of map, war mapper. On my map, that looks like Kupiansk, Svatva, Kreminna. And we're going to go just to begin with to the ISW to see what has taken place. So there had been unsuccessful attacks, Mazitivka, Bilohorivka, some of the usual places. Geolocated footage published on the 25th of May, so 2 days ago, indicates that Russian forces likely made marginal advances north of Novoselivska. So, I'm going to check that out. Where is Novoselivska? Well, that is next to Kuzumivka, which is between Svatva and Kupiansk. Kuzumivka is there, and there's been this ongoing fight over these settlements. There is a railway line separating the two, and in fact, this is on much higher ground here, or higher ground. Novoselivska to the west comes down into Kuzumivka. So, what is this geolocated footage? Well, there is one of the reconnaissance drones of the 92nd Brigade was patrolling at night and spotted a Russian assault platoon. So there is an assault platoon here. We're going to put that in to our Google Maps geolocation. Okay, so that is actually pretty much in the grey zone, really close to the Ukrainian front lines. I wouldn't say that signifies that there are marginal gains. It's just that they are probing, doing the usual kind of stuff that you'd expect in the middle of a war, probing the enemy front lines and seeing what you can do, where you can get to, and that's pretty much in the grey zone, and an assault platoon doing some stuff there. So activity taking place around Kuzumivka. And then, as we go back to the ISW, Ukrainian Deputy Defense Minister Malyar reported that Russian forces are attempting to capture positions in the Kupiansk direction to launch future offensive operations. Malyar also stated that Russian forces conducted a 24-hour tactical pause in the Kreminna area. Okay, so they are looking at the Kupiansk area. The claim is that the Russians might be thinking about some kind of attack from there at some point, and then a 24-hour pause in the Kreminna area, as according to the ISW. Ukrainian Severodonetsk military administration head Alexander Stryuk stated that Russian forces still maintain a large military presence in Severodonetsk area. Stryuk added that Russian forces are not diverting their units in Luhansk Oblast to reinforce the Russian-Ukrainian international border following the pro-Ukrainian Russian raid on Belgorod Oblast. There is this idea that maybe it was going to fix troops from the Luhansk area as they were potentially moved up to the Belgorod region to do some defensive work up there. That has not happened, and indeed it seems to be business as usual, at least as far as the Russian forces are concerned in this area. Okay, that means we are going to come down past Kreminna, past Bilohorivka, where there's some activity taking place. In fact, let's stop in Bilohorivka for a short while. Now, in this area, I reported yesterday there's a little bit of disagreement between Suryak Maps, pro-Russian mapper, and Deep State Map. Deep State Map does indicate that there's been some gains for the Russians just around this area, but doesn't have this refinery or filtration plant, that's it, in under the control of the Russians, and actually nor does Suryak Maps anymore. They say that's a grey area. So there was geolocation of Russian activity there some days ago in the ISW, so I moved that to be under Russian control. It seems to be that that's a place that's going backwards and forwards. Still no confirmation of this area up there. So there's a little bit of difference between the mappers, but essentially there is activity in Bilohorivka as you would expect. It hasn't changed there. It's not like they're not fighting. And then it's a case of coming down to Bakhmut again. We are going to have a look to begin with in the northern area. There's been a little bit of change over the last couple of days from the Deep State Maps shown, which I showed yesterday, just some slight gains for the Ukrainians in this particular area around Orikovo-Vasilivka. We'll go to see what the ISW has to say in general about Bakhmut before we go into the details. And as ever, that is at the front of their report. So They are talking about how Prigozhin is claiming that Wagner forces continue to hand over positions in Bakhmut to the Russian MOD and withdrawing from the city. We've seen him as a video coming out of him that came out about set, I don't know where, somewhere a long distance behind the front line, one would assume, at some Wagner camp where they are reconstituting. Bit of R&R, as they have been fighting there for a long time, and it must be incredibly exhausting for them. But it depends whether, he's going to pull out all of his convicts. Some of these convicts, apparently, troops are supposedly having their contracts extended another 3 months. If they've done something, remotely wrong, then they're not allowed to go back, or not allowed to be freed and go back into society. They're not going back to prison, but it's just a way of him, because he's not able to recruit, he needs to keep hold of those troops for longer. There are different claims as to how many troops he's lost. He made claims to 20,000 dead, 10,000 regular, and 10,000 convicts. That's a really interesting statistic that Reporting from Ukraine did some work on in their video last night. They spent pretty much the whole video talking about those stats and said that actually, if that's 10,000 lost out of the decent, regular mercenary troops, and that's a really high percentage that he's admitted. And one would assume that actually the real figures are going to be a lot more, because of the way that he was talking about those that have been let go back to. The convict troops have been allowed to go back into society, and the ones that are still there, there's a gap in his figures anyway. The long and the short of it is, from reporting from Ukraine's analysis, is that 20,000 dead is going to be a massive undercounting, and it's much likely far more than that. And then when you're talking about wounded, there's going to be a huge number to add to that. So it's been really expensive for the Wagner on their own admission, and that sits pretty well with the Ukrainian claims as to the Russian losses in the area. Of course, the question is how many have the Ukrainians lost, but at the very least, it has been an incredibly expensive project for the Russian MOD, and particularly for Wagner in terms of personnel. Ukrainian sources claim that Wagner forces are still present in Bakhmut, and that the tempo of Russian offensive operations around the city continues to decrease. Continued successful limited Ukrainian counterattacks on Bakhmut's flanks may complicate the Russian relief in place operation in Bakhmut. Russian mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces conducted successful counterattacks near Orokovo-Vasilivka, and that's to the northwest, and Klishchivka. A prominent mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian counterattacks near Orokovo-Vasilivka caused elements of the Veterani Private Military Company, PMC, to retreat up to a kilometer from their previously held positions in the area. Mill bloggers claim that Ukrainian forces captured elevated positions along the E40 Bakhmut to Sloviansk highway near Orokovo-Vasilivka, and that fighting is ongoing in the area. Well, let's go and pop along to have a look at that. That's in this particular area. So higher ground there, and the Ukrainians are pushing the Russians back, as I mentioned before. Indeed, if we go to Rebar, the pro-Russian source says the only comment on the entire front line they have, other than strikes, artillery, and whatnot, but actual grounds activity, is near Bakhmut. Ukrainian forces continue to undertake flank counterattacks against the positions of the Russians near Orokovo-Vasilivka, what we're talking about, under the onslaught of the enemy. So that's really strong words for Rebar. So this is a pro-Russian source saying that the Ukrainians they're conducting an onslaught. The defenders retreated in a northeasterly direction up to 1 kilometer. At the moment, the fighting for the wooded area continues. So that's going to be around here, and the wooded area could be this area that he's talking about there. There are other wooded areas, of course, as well. So it's difficult to know exactly what he's referring there. No report says of this area. As you can see, that's south of Orokovo-Vasilivka in this case, but the same general area. To the front, quite a lot has happened. North of Bakhmut, the AFU has taken over much of the area southwest of Orokovo-Vasilivka, cutting off the Russian supplies to Dubovo-Vasilivka, which you can see just there, just to the southeast of Orokovo-Vasilivka. It is unclear how far Russian troops have withdrawn, but the AFU has taken over strategic places. And then if we go on to look at Bakhmut in general, as according to Null reports, Bakhmut is under full control of Russian forces. He says a prisoner exchange took place south of Kromova. The line of defense is now east of Ivaniska. on the T-0504, but since Wagner has retreated and Russian forces have taken over positions, attacks have stopped. And that's all we hear about from that source. We go to War Mapper. Their mapping is they're obviously adapting their mapping across the across the spectrum of their maps at the moment, colors and how they are representing activity. Here we have the new Bakhmut map, where you can see that the grey zone contested is fairly much around all of the front line in the Bakhmut area. That Ukraine are pushing north and south, but the Russians are trying to push to the northwest in Kromova. So as we come down on my map, that's in this general area there, near to the 00506 highway coming out of Bakhmut. And then we have activity, I think, going on around the Adiivka reservoir as well. So that's where the Russians are pushing. The Ukrainians are pushing much more on the flanks. And then there were claims yesterday, I think, from the ISW that the Russians have eyes on Ivanivska. That's obviously going to be super important for the Ukrainians to hold there. We'll go back to the ISW now to finish off their analysis. A Russian mill blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces advanced towards Klishchiivka and crossed the Seversky Donetsk Canal, possibly threatening to encircle the settlement and force Russian forces to retreat towards the east. Geolocated footage published on May the 24th and 5th indicates that Russian forces likely regained limited positions west of Klishchiivka. So I was talking yesterday about some rejigging of the map in terms of what Andrew Perpetua did. So just to remind those of you who might have forgotten or newbies to this mapping video, the blue lines are the Russian lines as far as pro-Ukrainian mapper Andrew Perpetua is concerned. The yellow is pro-Ukrainian mapper Deep State map, and the red is pro-Russian mapper Syriac map. So in the Bakhmut area alone, the blue line normally represents the Ukrainian positions outside of Bakhmut, but in Bakhmut, I've changed it to representing the Russian lines as far as Andrew Perpetua is concerned. Now, yesterday, he adapted his mapping to show some gains for the Russians around there, and I was questioning whether they were gains or just rejigging the map. Poulet Volant, who's a mapper who also uses, it seems, Andrew Perpetua, reflected that in his mapping. He has no mapping changes today, saying there's no changes to the front line referred to as maps from yesterday. And yesterday, it was this kind of area that he showed that even though the Ukrainians are pressuring there and attacking, the Russians, that looked like a regaining, but I'm not sure whether it's regaining or rejigging. Anyway, it could be that the rejigging was based on this kind of geolocation. So here you see a smoking Russian tank, and in this film you can see the same tank tracked at night and destroyed at this position. We'll check that out by the Angels reconnaissance unit, and there's lots of activity around Klishchiivka. Okay, let's go and find out where that was. We're going to paste that in there, and then bish bash bosh. It is right on the edge of Syriac maps, Russian front line there. So that fits in line with pretty much all the mappers. And then I think there's a little bit more. Yeah, here we have location west of Klishchiivka. And this is so Ukrainian tactical group Adam drops explosives from drones onto Russian positions. And these were positions that Andrew Perpetua was talking about in his live stream the other night. We'll paste them in and see where that ends up being. And it's going to be, and this was indeed what Andrew Perpetua changed on the map, which is reflected in that Poulet Volant map, which is that little addition of that, I guess, corner there, I think is here, this corner. And so there was the rejigging the map to include this area, and that's because the Russians appear to have positions in this wooded area and in whatever that was, some kind of, I don't know, possibly agricultural area previous to the outbreak of this war. So the Russians do have positions there. I don't know how much territory the Ukrainians are gaining on a daily basis, or whether there is indeed a stasis in this area, the front line, as the Russians have piled in quite a number of reinforcements to the area. We just go to a further source, Defense Ministry itself, so Ukrainian Defense Ministry. Russian forces attempt to strengthen the flanks on the outskirts of Bakhmut. Russian forces are attempting to strengthen their positions on the flanks of the Bakhmut suburbs, relying on constant shelling to achieve this goal, Deputy Defense Minister Malia reported. That's 2 days ago. But it is, it is, I think, a continued reinforcement to try and strengthen these flanks so that they are not outmaneuvered, outflanked, and encircled in Bakhmut. So that's going to be super important for the Russians to do so they don't lose all the gains that they have made. But again, the goal here is to fix Russian troops into this area, to draw them from other areas to support here. And that appears to be what is happening and continues to happen. New York was hit by some serious sort of shelling, possibly FAB 500 bombs last night or yesterday. Anyway, we'll come on to Adiivka. The ISW says of Avdiivka, if we come back down, that the usual sort of places you hear Krasnohorivka to the north, Novokonyove to the north, assaults on those, repelled assaults. The Ukrainian Border Guard Service reported that Russian forces used chemical weapons in the Avdiivka area, but did not specify what kind. And then it sort of mentions Marinka, and that's it. So not a lot going on there, but the ISW does concentrate a little bit on this dam in Kharkivka, which I talked to you about yesterday, and showed you the topographic map to say how important it was that that was taken out, completely destroyed, and that then caused flooding all the way down the river. There's quite a lot of water in these reservoirs. That caused flooding down this river, which then fills up this dam, which potentially is full given the recent rains localized in this area. And that being full then has a chance of breaking or needing to be released, thus flooding this area, which then affects this major highway that sits on the low ground next to that river. So, in other words, the bombing of the Kharkivka Dam could affect movement of troops and resources all around this whole region. And so that's potentially a very clever thing for the Russians to have done, strategically speaking or operationally speaking. So the ISW says Russian forces destroyed this dam west of Adiivka. Geolocated footage published on May the 25th shows that a Russian strike destroyed the Karletsky Reservoir. Just to remind you what that looked like, that is the destruction. There's just a massive torrent of water coming down there. It really is quite significant. That, although that looks quite small, it is a lot of water that's piling out of there. So that is significant. Causing flooding downstream. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Russian forces struck down with an S-300 missile. The Ukrainian Donetsk military administration head Pavlo Krylenko stated that the destruction of the dam threatens to flood areas near Halistynivka and Zhelane. So that is indeed, those are, the places further down that I was telling you about. So Zhelane here and Halistynivka. Russian sources claim that Ukrainian forces used a road across the reservoir to support logistics towards Pisky, and that subsequent flooding could impact Kurakova. So this is true. This will affect, the prima facie problem. The initial, like on the face of it, problem is affecting this supply route, which is quite important. But there'll be workarounds to that that would just be annoying, but it's not the end of the world. And in fact, you could probably build. You would be able to at least sort some kind of bridging across it, even if you couldn't sort out the fixing the dam itself potentially, although it looks a bit dodge. But that's not going to be the main problem. The flooding is going to be the main problem, and that could impact Kurakove. So that is important because this is a major kind of hub, I believe, in terms of logistics for this whole region. And indeed, if Marinka falls, this would be one of their main goals, Kurakova. So that is, in the Russian sights, and they'll be wanting to negatively affect that as much as possible. So it then goes on to say flooding would impact Kurakove, Krasnohorivka, that's the southern Krasnohorivka, further disrupting Ukrainian logistics in the area. A prominent Russian mill blogger claimed that flooding will not cause critical damage to Ukrainian logistics, however. Yeah, I mean, it depends. There'll be ways around these problems, but it is an issue. It's not that it's not going to cause an issue. This, it will cause the Ukrainians to change what they are doing and make things more difficult, more lengthy, more inefficient in their logistics. And then, other than that, there's no other attacks, according to the ISW, in Western Donetsk. And it goes on to talking about the issues that the FOB 500 bombs and aviation strikes are causing in southern Ukraine. So, Russian forces continue to conduct airstrikes on Ukrainian positions in the region using FOB and KAB 500s, Berislav again, and Polohivsky region in Zaporizhia for those bombs. And on the other hand, the Ukrainians are kind of, well, not so much retaliating as doing their own damage behind Russian lines in a whole load of places, but they are the places I've talked to you about previously. So we have Mariupol being hit, Berdyansk being hit, Melitopol being hit, and so on and so forth. And I would assume, Tokmak, Polohy, Bilmak, all these usual places, Volnovaka could. Well, I'm not saying they have been hit last night, but those are the sorts of places, Vasilivka, that are consistently taken out. All targets around them are taken out, but Berdyansk and Mariupol are on a nightly. They are being consistently targeted on a nightly basis. But as I said, yeah, Berislav here on the Dnipro River near Kherson, and Kizimis is a favoured place of theirs around there, near the estuary opening of the Dnipro River. They are being hit by the aviation strikes, and that they are a bit of an issue. Those FAB and KAB 500 bombs, they are substantial explosions when they hit, and they can cause quite a lot of damage. And they seem to have somewhat more accuracy than the S300s that the Russians use. Although if they did use an S300 on that dam, that seemed to have hit plumb on, which is good for the Russians. I guess we don't know how many S300s they've thrown at that, but if that's true, if it was an S300, then that is a direct hit for the dam. So anyway, that's the Frontline update for the 27th of May 2023. I'm going to be put out to pasture now, so I'll be grazing on the fields, watching my son play football this afternoon. I may be able to get my third video out after that, but it might be later tonight because I have an interview, or I might be able to squeeze one in before football, but I doubt it. Anyway, you don't need to know that, but just giving you an update on where I'm at in terms of content. Take care, and I will speak to you soon.